Okay, teachers, if you could please scan your first period student for any student out of dress code doesn't have their ID on around their neck, top on the top, half visibly on their body. Also making sure those masks are in place on then properly wearing them on your nose and your mouth while I'm going over the other announcements. If they do not do these things, please either send them to their APs the first time or go ahead and write them up if this is a repeated theme. So we have completed our first week of the fifth 6 weeks. When it comes to grades, guess what, guys? There's no luck involved in passing. If you're not completing what you need to do each day and being all in, being prepared, staying checked in to completing your daily assignments in Canvas, so you can complete the academic school year. Failing in summer school are still a thing. So make sure you're doing what you can do. We put a lot of things in place to help you out. You have to utilize those. I know you're tired because we're tired too, but I promise to keep showing up and we'll give our all, but we expect the same for you. Good news is next week is spring break, and so we're going to take some time to refill the energy tank and check out of school a little bit and do some things that bring you some joy. Let's talk about masks. At this time, Lamar Consolidated is not adjusting any of the COVID-19 safety protocols, including the requirement of a face covering in all facilities. With George Ranch housing 2,000 people on a daily basis, and maintaining 6 feet apart at all times is just not possible with that many people. So masks are still mandatory. If you are zoned to Randall High School next year, if you need to check out my s'more, there is a whole lot of sports things in the s'more this week. So if you want to see some pictures and some stats and all of that good stuff, it is super long. So check out that. It's in your email. All you got to do is log into your LTIC email. If you're zoned to Randall High School, there's a meet and greet with Coach Randall for the families that are zoned to Randall next year. Also, we're going to have a live virtual speaker, Charlie Brenneman, during third period for both face-to-face and virtual. It'll be posted on your teacher's Canvas, third period Canvas page. Teachers, let me repeat that one more time. It will be posted on the third period teacher's Canvas page for Tuesday. Make sure you do that. The email is from Mr. Cuellar. College Wear Wednesday, rep your favorite college shirt with our GR staff. Let's see how many twins we have going on for the same college. Dual credit virtual information night is March 9th. Congrats to Cameron Crouch, named 2021 U.S. Presidential Scholars Program finalist, and Keely Rollinson for bringing home that silver medal in 6A state. She got the hardware. Welcome to Natasha Ware. If you haven't been in our counselor's office, Natasha Ware has joined the counseling team. She is up there to help you. If you pop in the counselor's office, please tell her a big welcome from the ranch. We have sports going on today. Lots of people away, but the people that we have here playing tonight, varsity baseball versus tomball here, and boys JV soccer and varsity soccer versus Clement here. Everyone else is away, so boys sophomore soccer at Clement, sophomore baseball at tomball, JV girls and varsity soccer at Clement, and JV baseball at tomball. Lots of stuff going on, lots of winning to bring home. We love you, and remember, if you can't be kind, be quiet.
Yes, ma'am. No, I cannot. You want to pass?
You're like, not really. I don't care. Nobody cares these days.
I mean, only because one time I threw my pass away, I got stopped. It was just annoying.
Okay, well, I'm not sure. I'm just scribble. I don't know how to write it. Like, yeah, I don't know how to spell your first name.
That's okay. No one does.
Yeah, I mean, I love you guys, but I'll be honest, that's not high on my list of
Things to do. I mean, and if it makes you feel better, nobody spells my name correctly either. So. Okay. So yeah, here we go. I realized that this said it was due on Friday. It was not due on Friday. I think we talked about that. The virtual kids might have already done it. And if they did, I apologize. Y'all ought to come to the Zooms where I explain things like this, but you don't come to the Zooms. It makes me sad. Okay. Chapter 24. The reactionary 20s. So we already talked about the 20s. We talked about like sort of what was going on in the 20s and some of the sort of drastic social changes that were occurring. Hopefully we've done enough history now to realize that anytime there are some significant shifts in culture and in sort of societal norms, There's also significant pushback, right? That shouldn't surprise you. That's something that we see today, right? So when you have sort of societal changes to where you can't have like Mr. Potato Head anymore because that's wrong. There's people that push back. Yeah, I don't know. Mr. Potato Head got canceled. I don't like the rules. I'm gonna be honest with you. Like I don't get it. I really don't. Like it's toy. They made a Mrs. Potato Head. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. And I'm pretty sure that like you can put the Mrs. Potato Head parts on the Mr. Potato Head and it doesn't matter. Which you would think that the people who would want to be canceling Misters and Mrs. would be okay with the fact that you can put the Mrs. parts on the Mr. I don't know, whatever. That's a whole different conversation for a whole other time. Okay, so reactionary sort of conservatism, and we actually generally call this conservatism because conservatism as a sort of ideology, first of all, I need you to understand that this is not the same conservatism that you might think about politically today, right? So, although I teach government a lot, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure that there's a really good definition of what conservatism is today. But we're not talking about a political sort of concept here when we talk about conservatism. We're talking about a sort of societal concept, okay? And conservatism in terms of a societal concept is the idea that we want sort of traditional things, right? Like now all of a sudden we have jazz music that we talk about in the 1920s and it's loud and it's like, it's scary and we don't like that. Like we want the like one guitar and somebody singing words that we understand rather than the ski bop, whatever, right? Okay. So the reality is that the majority of Americans don't necessarily see themselves as part of this sort of new 20s culture, right? They don't see themselves as the lost generation or as a part of the jazz age. Most of your sort of white middle class America, and the 20s has a significant middle class, right? You have massive sort of wealth increases amongst the rich during the 1920s. But some of that aspect of like trickle down economics does actually work at this point. Okay. And so a lot of these people don't necessarily see themselves as fitting into this new culture, right? So that's sort of the middle class. Like they want things the way that they were, right? Like it was very comfortable. Like once you get into the middle class, the reality is the middle class is generally the class that's going to push back against change. Because the middle, like once you make middle class, it's just kind of a comfortable life, right? Like poor people are always for change because being poor sucks, right? Rich people don't really care one way or the other because they're like hedonistic gluttons. You know what those words mean? So hedonistic means like pleasures of the flesh, right? And glutton is just like to an excess, right? Like if you're a glutton, you overeat. Like rich people can just do whatever they want. Like, hey, I'm gonna go buy a yacht and drink like 6 bottles of Cristal because why not, right? Okay. They have that sort of wealth to where the rules don't really apply to them in the same manner as they do other people. We do see some significant increases in immigration during this period. That probably shouldn't surprise you because obviously we just got out of World War I. World War I was fought predominantly in Europe, right? And so what do you think happened to Europe? Like Take a wild guess what happens when war comes to your country. A lot of people die. What else happens? Like when we drop a bomb on something, does it just kill people? What else does it destroy? Buildings and infrastructure. And we go back to like the Civil War, right? We talked about Sherman's march to the sea where he burnt like a 20-mile wide path. Just burn everything. Screw it. We're gonna just burn everything on our way to the sea, right? As a means of warfare. Okay, so when you have war, and this is why the United States, like, we don't really get war in this country. We really don't. Because outside of like 2 terrorist attacks, right? Like 9/11 and then Pearl Harbor in December of 41, right? Outside of those 2 events, like, we've never really had war brought to our doorstep. We've never taken shelter in like the fallout of a building, right? That's like got no roof and is missing a wall because of like debris and things like that, right? So obviously you can stay and rebuild, but rebuilding is costly, it's time consuming, and it's not necessarily the best idea, right? So it shouldn't surprise you then that following war, you've got a whole bunch of people that are trying to move to the United States, right? Okay, so now with increases in immigration, we have sort of a return to nativism, right? Like the idea of, hey, if you weren't here already, like, we don't really want you, like, we have an American way of life, you're Hungarian or Greek or whatever, because now predominantly it's Eastern European peoples that are coming, right? And so we actually begin to restrict immigration. We have like, a quota system. We decrease the number of visas that we're giving. And so we significantly decrease the percentage of or the number of immigrants that are coming into the United States. Another reason for this is that the idea here of these 2 guys, so they're Italian immigrants who come to the United States, and they are seen as sort of a threat to democracy, right? So I know we didn't talk about this in great detail, but during World War I, the Soviet Union is formed, okay? So in the middle of World War I, Russia had like a king. They called him a czar. That's what the leader of Russia is called. The czar is overthrown by a man named Vladimir Lenin and his followers, right? Like his poor people. And they established the first communist government in the world. Communism is a direct threat to democracy. It will always be a direct threat to democracy because communism is incompatible with democracy. And you can't have both. Just can't. Okay, not even really 100% certain you can have democratic socialism like Bernie Sanders wants. Okay, so the another reason for the rise in nativism and fear of immigrants is we don't want people coming to the United States who would subvert the sort of American way of life as it pertains to communism as well, right? So we're going to have our own little Red Scare. These 2, as far as immigrants go, I think that they were on trial for, I think they killed somebody in the course of an armed robbery. I think, if I remember correctly, it was a murder. And so they're sort of the face of that anti-immigration, like, oh, all immigrants coming. Like, have you seen some of the way that like really like redneck conservative people talk about like Hispanic immigrants today? Like they're all criminals and murderers and MS-13 gang members, and they're just coming here to like rape and plunder and steal like they're pirates. No, you never heard that? some people will use like language like that in an attempt to scare you. These guys are two Italians, and Italians, like believe it or not, Italians are fairly poorly perceived amongst even whites, right? So there's a significant amount of discrimination, especially in the New England area in the Northeast, that occurs against sort of non-Anglo whites, right? So if you're not like, if you're not, you know, English, French, German, maybe Scandinavian to some extent, but like, God forbid if you're Catholic, right? Like that's terrible. So the Italians, the Irish, Jews are persecuted, things like that. Right? You also get a sort of re-emergence of the KKK. So obviously the KKK was established by a former Confederate general following the loss of the Civil War. The idea here is that the KKK is now going to expand. They're no longer just focused on the South, and they certainly are no longer just focused on sort of free blacks, right? Or simply that. The reality is the KKK at this point in time basically hates any non-white Christian, right? And even like, I mean, if you're like a Lutheran German coming to the United States, like the KKK is probably going to be suspect of even you. You know what I mean? But God forbid you're Catholic. God forbid you're you know, sort of Mediterranean looking with, you know, like slightly darker skin, like Greek or Southern Italian. You know, Jewish people, and then obviously like blacks, because they've been dealing with the KKK now for half a century, basically at this point. But the KKK begins to expand its sort of purpose, like the people that it's attacking, it begins to become more broad, which is really a part of the rise of nativism, right? And that nativist attitude. We also see sort of an increase in fundamentalism. It goes along with conservatism in some regards, right? So when you talk about conservatism as being sort of, let's maintain the old ways, the status quo, we don't want any change, we don't want any progress. Fundamentalism is also this very anti-progressive ideology. And the Scopes trial is probably the best example of this. So Darrow is a teacher in Tennessee, if memory serves, who decides in 1929, is it in my notes? I don't remember. 1925, that he's going to teach. Oh no, 25 is when the law was made. Maybe it is 29. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. It's not in my notes. I don't care about the exact year, right? But it's the late 1920s. Darrow decides he's going to teach the theory of evolution, right? You know what evolution is? Yes. And the state of Tennessee has outlawed that because, you know, God forbid, pun intended, we teach anything other than like biblical creationism as to how humanity arrived, right? I'm not sure why some peoples would be afraid of that, but they are, and this goes on to become like a huge deal. William Jennings Bryan actually becomes is the attorney against Darrow. He's a former presidential candidate, right? I mean, this becomes a very high profile case. Everybody is following this because now you sort of see new ways of thinking, new ideologies, And it's scary for a lot of people, especially sort of your more conservative fundamentalist individuals, because this is now happening in schools. And if we teach this to children, if we teach children sort of progressive ideologies, then they're going to grow up and they're going to be progressive. And then, you know, we're going to sort of eradicate American culture, or at least drastically change American culture because of this. And so there's a significant pushback to it, right? To this sort of biblical fundamentalism that's occurring. Right? Prohibition is part of this sort of fundamentalist aspect too. I think we talked about the temperance movement once already, didn't we? Does that sound familiar? Temperance, right? Because I think we talked about how, you know, guys would go work in the factory, and working in factories sucked, and you'd be there for, you know, 10 or 12 hours a day, and then on Friday you get your paycheck and you go straight to the bar and you would drink yourself into a stupor, and then you would stumble home and your wife would like rob you of whatever money you had left so that hopefully she could feed the children for the remainder of the week, right? Like, sadly, that was a fairly common occurrence. Well, in 1919, we're going to outlaw alcohol in the United States.
Thank you. Let me call you next period, can I? Yeah, I'm teaching. I know. Let me call you next period. You'll be fine. Bye.
All right. So the Volstead Act is actually what outlaws. The Volstead Act is part of what outlaws, or how do I explain it? So the 19th Amendment. No, that's a lie. The 18th Amendment. 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. 18th Amendment outlaws alcohol. The Volstead Act is basically how we're going to enforce the 18th Amendment. Does that help? Right? So obviously I can be like, hey, no more booze, right? But then if I just tell you no more booze, I mean, like, let's be honest, y'all aren't allowed to drink alcohol because you're under the age of 21. And I'm not saying that you drink alcohol, right? But I bet you've got a friend who has, at least on one occasion, right? You don't have to rat yourself out. Don't rat your friend out. Right? Okay. So laws without enforcement are really not laws at all, right? There's no penalty for it. If there's no like, don't do that, but then you do it and nobody cares. Like, it's not a real law. So the Volstead Act is how we're going to go about enforcing it, which is a way of trying to like really ensure that you don't get alcohol. But the problem is, or one of the problems, maybe there's many problems with this. One of the problems is that when you create laws, you generally create loopholes. There's a fair number of loopholes in this. But two, the funny thing is something like prohibition never ever works, because basic supply and demand say that it won't work, right? Again, you can take sort of marijuana as the same sort of example, right? Like, marijuana is illegal in the state of Texas. Again, I'm not saying you do it, right? But my guess is you know somebody that does. They don't care. Doesn't matter that it's illegal. They're going to find a market. They're going to find a supplier, right? They're willing to pay for the product. Basic supply and demand. Okay? The supply and demand of alcohol doesn't change just because it is made illegal, right? Which does create some opportunity for bootlegging and things of that nature that creates. I mean, it's a rise in organized crime and racketeering in all sorts of off the book illegal activity. Right, because now all of a sudden, people that are selling alcohol, they didn't stop selling it, but people that are selling alcohol no longer pay taxes. There's no longer a sales tax on it, right? The consumption of alcohol. There's some studies that show that the consumption of alcohol in the 1920s actually increases rather than decreases with prohibition, which is sort of comical if you think about it. But the opportunities that exist then in order to create sort of criminal enterprises and make money and whatnot, is really, really good. And then with all of this too, you have to, like, once you make something like this illegal, and if you actually try to enforce it, you now have to increase sort of policing, and you have to increase prisons and prison populations for people that are violating the law. And so ultimately it becomes really, really, really expensive. Expensive to the point that that eventually we're not going to expensive to the point that we're not going to be able to maintain prohibition because it's detrimental to the welfare of the nation. In fact, by the time we repealed prohibition with the 21st Amendment, we do so in part because we need to tax the sale of alcohol in order to try to generate some sort of revenue for the government. And the 1920s sees a sort of Republican resurgence. So you had, and here's the thing, we're at a period in American history where it's sort of difficult for me to explain to you Republicans and Democrats. Because let's just say 1880, right? Which party is the Progressive Party, Republicans or Democrats? You know? The Republican Party is the Progressive Party, right? Like Lincoln is a Republican. The Republicans want to like free blacks and like give them voting rights and like let them become real members of society. And it's the Democrats that are like, no, we want them as slaves again. They're inferior. Like they shouldn't have voting rights. By the time you get to like the 1900, Teddy Roosevelt is a Republican. And just so you understand, Teddy Roosevelt establishes the national park system, right? He's very anti-big business, right? Like he busts up a lot of monopolistic companies, right? One of his nicknames is the Trust Buster, because he busts up, monopolies and anti-competitive organizations, right? Which is not a very quote unquote Republican thing to do in the way we think of Republicans today. But Teddy's a Republican. And so to say a Republican resurgence, really what happens here is you get a Republican Party that is going to champion traditional ideals, traditional values. They're going to champion sort of the everyday man, right? Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, and Wilson, because Wilson was president up until 1920. My argument to you, and this is just my sort of historical argument, Woodrow Wilson is probably one of 6 or 7 presidents in terms of American history that you should absolutely know, and you should know a fair amount about. Because Woodrow Wilson, I would probably argue Woodrow Wilson is the worst president in the history of the United States. And yeah, it's a bold statement. Like a couple of you just kind of look like, holy cow, the worst. Like we've had some bad ones. Yes, we have. Right? I mean, I would pretty much argue that there's not been a good president in my lifetime. And there have been a couple that have been okay, but not a good president in my lifetime. Woodrow Wilson is probably the worst president in American history. Not only does he have a whole bunch of domestic policies that are wildly detrimental, he's responsible for getting us involved in World War I, which we probably didn't need to be involved in. And so in 1920, Republicans have a real chance to win. And so the Republicans sort of champion this idea of traditional values because Wilson is really the first true progressive, right? He's an academic. He was the president of, I believe, Harvard before he was president of the United States. He's one of those guys that believes that like the highly educated experts should make all decisions for people, and that Americans are basically stupid and need to have their lives like governed for them. And so the 1920s become an opportunity for a sort of Republican reimaging, right? Like all of a sudden Republicans be like, hey, we don't want this heavy-handed government. We just want like life as it used to be. We're going to go back to how things were, return to normalcy, like no more war, right? The Great War is over. We don't want government dictating every aspect of your life. Just go and you do you. Which is fairly popular amongst the people, right? Now, when the Republicans take over in 1920, we have fairly high unemployment. When I say fairly high unemployment, I'm talking about just over 10%, right? You know what unemployment was like? No, actually, let's go with a year ago. You know what unemployment hit when we like shut everything down for COVID? What did it hit? You know the numbers? No. Roughly the same as it hit here in 1920, right? So you're looking at like just over 10%, right? 10 to 12, 13, maybe 14%. And that's fairly significant. And this is not an economics class, but just real quick sort of economic lesson for you. You can't have zero unemployment. Zero unemployment is actually really bad, right? Because it means that you've got all kinds of like unqualified people in jobs that they shouldn't be in, and they're probably doing a terrible job because employers just have to hire whoever because there's more jobs than there is labor. A good economy is going to have roughly 3% unemployment, right? 2 to 3% unemployment is probably a good number. Here we're 4 or 5 times that number, right? We're somewhere around 12% unemployment. And additionally, we have a significant national debt now because obviously we had to borrow in order to pay for a war because wars are ridiculously expensive, like ridiculously expensive. Because you have to pay the soldiers, and then you have to pay like life insurance for the guys that die, and you have to pay for like the bullets and the bombs and the planes and the tanks and the everything else, right? And so one of the things that the Republicans do is they're going to try to rectify the budgeting process in order to spend less money in order to save. They also decrease taxes. And so in order to decrease taxes and still generate revenue, you have to have a very robust economy. I mean, your economy has to be very strong and growing. We have that in the 1920s. It actually really works. We deregulate in the 20s. Regulation just means government sort of involvement or interference within business. Republicans deregulate. The 1920s is basically what Republicans have been trying to recreate every time they take office forever and ever and ever. And that's what they've been trying to do. You essentially get down to almost nobody paying taxes at this point. But you do have tariffs, right? And tariffs are aimed at decreasing imports into the country. So that way we manufacture things here, and that stimulates our economic growth, right? Again, not an economics class, but one of the best ways that you can sort of stimulate economic growth within your country is to make a whole bunch of crap. And when I say crap, I do mean literal crap, like stuff that will break after like 5 years. And you make it all in your country, and then you sell it outside of your country. right? So that way you give them some crap product that they have to buy another one in a couple of years for, and they give you money. And that stimulates economic growth within your country, and it brings wealth into your country, and it like depletes wealth in other countries. And that doesn't mean that like wealth is a pie that the size of which doesn't change. It absolutely does, right? Like it's not a zero sum game. Like you can create new wealth and you can change the size of the pie. But that's how you get more of the pie, or at least one easy way. So we're going to have tariffs in order to try to decrease imports into the United States. We try to deregulate, right? So it's a reduced regulation. It's seen as a hindrance to economic prosperity, because every time you have sort of bureaucratic red tape, government regulations, like things that businesses have to do for a government, it decreases their opportunity to create wealth or income or economic growth. The Republicans in the 1920s actually do sort of support some radical progressivism, though, in the sense that that they're openly opposed to like the KKK and other sort of racist movements throughout the country, right? Like Wilson as president, despite the fact that he's this great like democratic progressive president, Wilson was terribly racist. He actually like created it, like he barred black people from working for the national government, right? Harding in the 1920s is going to overturn that and sort of push for a little bit more racial equality and racial harmony within the United States. That being said, there's still some limitations to it, right? Like we're not doing we're not going so far as to say like interracial marriage is okay. There's not true like social equality, but we'll at least allow for a little bit of economic equality, right? Like black people can still have opportunities to get jobs and work for the government and make money. Like I already told you, there is now a growing fear of communism in the United States. That's a setback for unions, right? Because unions protect labor, and labor is what causes communist revolutions, and therefore we're weary of what unions will do for the United States. As far as foreign policy in the 1920s go, we engage in isolationism. Wilson creates his 14 points. And Wilson sort of creates the League of Nations. We talked about this once already. The Senate, and now I'm drawing a blank on the dude's name that sort of led the opposition to it. But the Senate of the United States refuses to ratify that treaty, which ultimately leads to a return to isolationism. We're not going to get involved in the world stage. We don't want to sort of be forced into meddling with European affairs. There are some attempts at disarmament. Disarmament simply means the reduction of sort of weapons and arms and standing militaries. I think we talked about this already with World War I, didn't we? That militarism was a key factor in World War I, right? Like countries had built up their military, and once you've built up your military, there's really no purpose for building up a military other than to use it. And so afterwards, we're like, hey, we probably shouldn't have these massively large standing armies. That doesn't really work. Okay, it's not a great success. Okay, the idea of war debts and reparations will play a role moving forward. So obviously the U.S. has war debts, and a lot of countries, specifically your European countries that were involved in this, and some of those countries owe debts to the United States, and Germany has reparations that they have to pay for having caused World War I. The economics of this are actually very volatile. And part of what leads to the rise of sort of Hitler and the Nazi state in Germany in World War II. Germany ends up basically with hyperinflation in the 1920s. Hyperinflation is basically where like the value of German currency skyrockets, or excuse me, decreases, right? Like the value of it drops astronomically. To where a loaf of bread goes from like $1 to $1,000. That's hyperinflation. And so the Germans, now at that point, like they can just sort of pay off their debts very, very easily. The U.S. doesn't join the World Court. Again, sort of part of that League of Nations idea. We don't want to get involved in it. We don't want to be held accountable to the rest of the world. We only want to be held accountable to ourselves. And so in doing that, we're going to return more to a Monroe Doctrine, in which we're looking at Latin America and improving relations with Latin America and Caribbean countries and trying to sort of maintain our focus on the Western Hemisphere, as that's what is most significant for us. The Teapot Dome affair, Harding's administration in the early 1920s is sort of plagued by some corruption. Again, it's an opportunity for a lot of people to be making money. There's very, very little regulation and government interference in what is going on, which basically affords people the opportunity to try to like sidestep some things and create some backroom deals that are ultimately negative, right? So Teapot Dome is a government-owned oil deposit. So like the Department of the Interior is sort of in charge of it. And ultimately, the guy that's running the Department of the Interior is taking bribes to allow specific companies the authority, the opportunity, or the right to drill for the oil in that area. And so it's detrimental to Harding and everything else that he's accomplished. For the most part, Harding's a decent president. This Teapot Dome affair and this oil scandal is for the most part all anybody is going to remember from him moving forward. Calvin Coolidge, go listen to a podcast on Coolidge. Conservatives now sort of revere Calvin Coolidge. And Coolidge was and is and probably will always remain vastly different from the majority of presidents. He sort of believes that the presidency is not that big of a deal, right? That the man shouldn't be bigger than the office. He's nicknamed Silent Cal. There's an old story in the podcast might have said it. I don't remember. The reporter at like a White House dinner, a reporter went up to Coolidge and said, I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words, right? And Coolidge's own response was, "You lose." That's it. He didn't speak. He was known as Silent Cal. He was absolutely a champion for capitalism, for the sort of free market. He doesn't want government interference. He doesn't want government doing very much. For a long time in U.S. history, people ripped Coolidge. They're like, "Oh, he was a terrible president. He didn't do anything." Coolidge intentionally didn't do anything. And it's not that he didn't do anything because he was lazy. It's not that he didn't do anything because he was inept or didn't know what to do. He didn't do anything because he felt like the president shouldn't be doing things, right? If you take my government class next year, one of the things that you should learn in government is that the 3 branches of our U.S. government are not equal. They were not designed to be equal. We don't have three co-equal branches of government. Congress was designed to wield the majority of power. Coolidge believes that, right? Now that doesn't happen anymore. We don't see that anymore. Congress is now a do-nothing Congress. Congress doesn't work anymore. They don't do their job anymore, right? Coolidge steps back as president of the United States and basically looks at Congress to do your job. Because it's not my job to do it. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing your job for you. And so that's sort of the idea of Coolidge's concept there, right? So Coolidge is now sort of seen as a better president than what he used to be seen. Herbert Hoover is going to take over, and he's sort of the last Republican president for a long time. Again, sort of progressive conservatism. Hoover is very much a humanitarian. He cares about the people, which is a little ironic, considering that ultimately he's going to get the blame for the Great Depression, and all these little cardboard cities that pop up are actually called Hoovervilles. But he's looking at trying to push forward some conservative ideologies while still maintaining some sort of general welfare and general caring about the people. The Mississippi River flood here in 27 is a good example. The Mississippi floods regularly, but Hoover sort of sets the national government to trying to help those people that were adversely affected. It really is compassionate sort of conservatism. He wants to see the government aiding and helping those people that actually need help, but not being sort of overly involved. Okay? The election of 28. So Smith versus Hoover. Coolidge doesn't run for a second term. So Hoover is the guy who's sort of set up to take over. Hoover's going to try to prop up farming, right? Farming was on the last slide as well. So during the 1920s, even though there's great prosperity, farmers don't always get to take part in that prosperity because basic economics makes it sort of hard for farmers to do that. That's something that Coolidge, that Harding wanted to help and be a part of. In 1929, obviously, we have a massive turning point. The stock market crashes at the onset of the Great Depression. We were basically buying stock on credit, which is a terrible, terrible idea. It's like buying a lottery ticket with a credit card. What happens once the stock market crashes? Then I want to say it's a year or 2 years later, we get a run on the banks, right? So now people want their money out of banks because they don't trust banking institutions. The stock market collapse is part of sort of a global economic collapse in the 1930s as well. So the reason behind it, again, depending on sort of where you fall on the political spectrum and where you fall sort of ideologically, you can blame government for it, for government's lack of sort of oversight of the economy. But while government probably does bear some responsibility, there's also some just individual personal behaviors, such as speculation, buying on credit that negatively affects it, as well as global impacts from what's going on in Europe and the hyperinflation in Germany, and Germany basically defaulting on a bunch of its debts and things like that. That leads to sort of your shanty towns, your little cardboard towns that pop up. People are hungry, they're homeless. You have nomads, sort of wandering the countryside, with the idea of like, we'll work for food, sort of concepts. The Depression becomes utterly catastrophic It hits farmers pretty hard too, as there's a drought around about the same time that creates some real hardship in the plains. Because theoretically, in this economic downturn, that should actually help farmers because they should be able to sort of grow crops and feed the people. And people aren't buying other things for excess, so they would be spending money on food, right? They're not buying booze and jewelry and fancy cars and things like that. Not only I mean, obviously it affects minorities as well, but there are a number of subsets of the population. I mean, everybody is adversely affected. At one point by like 32 or the early 30s, you get the unemployment in the United States at almost a quarter, almost 25%, right? Like we talked about right after World War I, we had really bad unemployment at like 12%. Now it's double, right? It's catastrophic. You know, you get like a job opening. There's a story in the late 30s, the government having like a couple of custodial positions open for the federal government and got over 150,000 applicants, right? Like 150,000 people applying for 2 or 3 jobs. And then obviously, just like we've seen with other instances, when you have sort of these terrible times, it's always a little bit worse for the minorities. You know, there's backlash to that, right? Like when a black person has a job and a white person can't find one, well, he took my job and, you know, he's supposed to be inferior and this, that, and the other. Like I think I told you a minute ago, Hoover's going to get the blame for the depression. It's probably not his fault, honestly. But he's going to take the blame for it anyways, which leads to sort of the rise of FDR and his opportunity. Again, Hoover's still a conservative. He might be a compassionate conservative, but he doesn't want the government to be heavy-handed in all of this. And he basically tries to convince people to volunteer and be compassionate themselves, right? That charities should handle this stuff rather than the government. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation is trying to keep, so Congress basically creates an organization that's trying to keep certain businesses afloat. That's you know, ultimately unsuccessful. One of the good things that does come out of this is Glass-Steagall, which is legislation that's aimed at dividing banks. Glass-Steagall exists all the way up until the Clinton administration, and the Clinton administration gets rid of it, and that's really what leads to the Depression, or what we call the Great Recession of like 2006, because we got rid of Glass-Steagall. So ultimately, Hoover can't win, right? So he's going to lose to FDR in 32, and that's the lecture for Wednesday, right? We'll talk about the 1930s and FDR and his response to the Great Depression in more detail. All right. Thanks, guys. So you've got a quiz today. What's up?
Is